There is no room for people like you on this flight." Those 10 words would cost Blake Morrison everything he had ever worked for, destroy a billionaire's faith in humanity, and trigger the most expensive act of karma in aviation history. But at 6:47 p.m. on New Year's Eve, as the worst blizzard in Chicago's recent memory buried O'Hare International Airport under 3 feet of snow, Blake Morrison had no idea he was about to make the mistake that would change multiple lives forever. The automatic doors of Terminal 3's main concourse hissed open, letting in a blast of sub-zero wind that cut through the heated air like a knife. Zara Mitchell stepped through those doors, looking like she had been fighting the storm for hours, and in many ways she had been fighting storms her entire life. She wore a charcoal gray hoodie that had seen better days with a coffee stain near the left pocket that she hadn't bothered to clean after her marathon 14-hour acquisition meeting. Her worn Timberland boots left small puddles of melted snow on the polished marble floor as she adjusted her oversized beige scarf and shook the frost from her shoulder-length black hair. To anyone watching, Zara looked like exactly what she appeared to be on the surface. A tired graduate student, maybe, or perhaps a weary traveler who had spent too many hours in transit and too many dollars on overpriced airport coffee. There was nothing about her appearance that suggested she was worth $2.8 billion. Nothing that hinted at the fact that the battered leather backpack slung over her shoulder contained a laptop with acquisition documents that had just made her the owner of the very building she was standing in. The meeting had been brutal, lasting from 4 a.m. until just 2 hours ago, with lawyers who treated billion-dollar deals like gladiator matches and city officials who seemed to view every comma in the contract as an opportunity for negotiation. Zara had built her infrastructure empire from the ground up, starting with a single government contract to repair power grids in Detroit after the 2019 outages, and now Horizon Infrastructure Group managed everything from electrical systems to internet backbone across 17 states. She had learned to navigate rooms full of men who underestimated her, who looked at her young face and soft voice and assumed she was someone's assistant, until she started speaking in the language of engineering specs and profit margins. But tonight, all of that seemed very far away from her mind as she checked her simple digital Casio watch and felt her chest tighten with anxiety. Flight 847 to London Heathrow was still showing green on the departures board, one of only 3 international flights that hadn't been canceled due to the storm. Her grandmother, the woman who had raised her in a cramped apartment in Detroit's Corktown neighborhood after her parents died in a car accident when she was 7, was dying. The doctors had said weeks, maybe days, and Zara had been flying back and forth between London and Chicago for the past month, trying to balance the biggest business deal of her career with spending what little time remained with the person who mattered most to her. The airport was in chaos. The kind of beautiful disaster that only happens when Mother Nature decides to remind humans exactly how little control they actually have over their carefully planned lives. Families slept on makeshift beds made from carry-on luggage and airport blankets. Business travelers paced in circles while shouting into their phones about missed meetings, and the various food courts had run out of everything except overpriced candy bars and stale pastries. The departure boards flickered with an endless scroll of red canceled notices, and the customer service lines stretched so far that they disappeared around corners and merged with other lines, creating a human maze of frustration and exhaustion. Zara had seen storms before, both literal and metaphorical, and she knew that panic was just wasted energy. She navigated through the sea of stranded passengers with the kind of quiet efficiency that comes from years of being the only person in the room who knows how to fix the problem everyone else is complaining about. She had learned early in life that being underestimated was often an advantage, that people revealed their true nature when they thought they were dealing with someone powerless, and that real strength was almost always quiet and observant rather than loud and demanding. As she approached the British Airways check-in area, her phone buzzed with a text from her assistant back in Detroit. Acquisition paperwork filed with Citi at 4:23 p.m. Congratulations, boss. You officially own Terminal 3 now. Zara allowed herself a small smile as she tucked the phone back into her pocket. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was about to board a plane from a building she had just purchased. But all of that business success felt meaningless compared to the race against time to see her grandmother one last time. Blake Morrison had been working at O'Hare for 5 years, and in that time he had never once called in sick, never once been late for a shift, and never once failed to meet his customer processing targets. But lately it felt like none of that mattered, because the world seemed determined to crush him under an avalanche of problems that he couldn't solve with perfect attendance and a cheerful attitude. The gate agent position at British Airways had seemed like a dream job when he first got it, especially after 2 years of working retail at a cell phone store where customers treated him like he personally manufactured every device that broke and caused every service outage that interrupted their lives. The airport job, paid better, came with flight benefits he couldn't afford to use, and gave him the kind of stable schedule that meant he could pick up his 8-year-old son Marcus from school 3 days a week when his custody arrangement allowed it. But that was before his ex-wife Sarah decided to file for full custody, claiming that his inconsistent work schedule and financial instability made him an unfit parent. That was before his mother's diabetes got so bad that she needed insulin that cost $600 a month even with insurance, and before the overtime pay he desperately needed got cut due to the airline's new efficiency initiatives that somehow never seemed to make anything more efficient for the employees who actually dealt with passengers all day. Blake stood behind the British Airways podium in the priority access lane, watching the endless stream of stranded passengers and trying to calculate how many extra hours he would need to work to make his rent payment on time. His supervisor, Janet Cruz, had made it clear during their last meeting that his performance reviews were satisfactory but not exceptional, which was corporate speak for "you're doing fine, but we're not giving you a raise anytime soon." Janet was the kind of manager who spoke in buzzwords about customer engagement metrics and brand loyalty optimization, but seemed to have never actually spoken to a human being who was tired, frustrated, and just wanted to get home to their family. The Employee of the Month award hanging on the wall behind Blake's station was supposed to be a source of pride, but lately it just felt like a participation trophy for showing up and following the script. He had won it exactly once last month, after helping an elderly passenger navigate a connection during a thunderstorm delay. But even that small victory felt hollow when his Christmas bonus got denied, because some customer had complained that he was too slow during the holiday rush. The truth was that Blake had gotten into this job because he genuinely wanted to help people during what was often the most stressful part of their travel experience, but the longer he worked in the industry, the more he realized that helping people and keeping management happy were often two completely different things. The airline's policies were written by people who had never worked a gate during a major weather event, never had to explain to a crying child why their family vacation was canceled, and never had to choose between following the rules and doing what was actually right for the human being standing in front of you. Earlier that day, Blake had spent 20 minutes helping an elderly woman figure out rebooking options after her flight to see her new grandchild got canceled, and while she had been grateful enough to write a compliment card, Janet had later pulled him aside to remind him that customer processing efficiency was more important than excessive hand-holding for passengers who should be able to use the self-service options. It was the kind of feedback that made Blake question whether he was cut out for a job that seemed to value speed over compassion and metrics over basic human decency. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah's lawyer about the custody hearing next week, and Blake felt his stomach drop as he read about additional legal fees and required documentation that would cost money he didn't have for a fight he couldn't afford to lose. Marcus was the best part of his life, the one thing that made all the stress and struggle worthwhile, and the thought of seeing his son only every other weekend because he couldn't prove financial stability was enough to make Blake seriously consider taking bribes from passengers if it meant keeping his family together. The irony was that Blake had grown up poor, raised by a single mother who worked 3 jobs to keep them housed and fed, and he had sworn that his own child would never experience the kind of instability and uncertainty that had defined his childhood. But now, as he stood in his pressed uniform with his employee badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights, he felt like he was right back where he started, one emergency away from losing everything that mattered, one bad decision away from proving that he was exactly as unreliable as his ex-wife claimed. Janet appeared at his shoulder like a bad omen, carrying her tablet and wearing the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. "Blake, I need to talk to you about your complaint metrics," she said in the tone of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis. "We've had 3 negative customer surveys this week, and I need you to remember that passenger satisfaction is directly tied to your performance bonus eligibility." She paused, tapping something on her screen. "I'm going to need you to really focus on keeping our premium passengers happy tonight. Mr. Harwick is supposed to be flying out, and he's one of our Platinum members who specifically requested excellent service after his last experience with us was somewhat disappointing." Blake nodded, feeling the familiar knot in his stomach that came with being reminded that his job security depended on factors largely outside his control. He had learned that in the airline business, customer satisfaction often had very little to do with actual service quality and everything to do with whether passengers got what they wanted, regardless of policy logic or fairness to other travelers. Christopher Harwick had built his real estate empire on a simple philosophy: money talks, and everything else is just noise. At 47 years old, he had spent the last 2 decades accumulating properties, influence, and the kind of connections that meant his phone calls got returned immediately and his dinner reservations never got lost in the system. But lately his empire was starting to crumble, and the carefully constructed facade of success was developing cracks that no amount of money could completely hide. The bankruptcy filing, hidden behind a maze of shell companies and offshore accounts, was supposed to buy him time. But his wife's divorce attorney had been more thorough than expected, and the forensic accountants were getting uncomfortably close to discovering just how much debt he was carrying and how many corners he had cut to maintain his lifestyle. The gambling addiction that started as a way to blow off steam after stressful negotiations had evolved into something much darker and more desperate, and his recent losses at the private poker games in Chicago had put him in debt to people who didn't accept payment plans or sob stories. The flight to London wasn't a vacation, it was an escape route. Christopher had moved $4.2 million to accounts in the Cayman Islands over the past 6 months, slowly and carefully, in amounts small enough to avoid triggering automatic reporting requirements. If he could get to London and then catch a connection to Nassau, he could disappear for long enough to restructure his affairs and come back with a story about temporary business difficulties rather than the complete financial collapse that was about to destroy everything he had worked for. Blake Morrison had been useful during Christopher's previous flights because the young gate agent was clearly struggling financially and responded well to generous tips and the kind of attention that made him feel important. Christopher had learned early in his career that everyone had a price, and that price was usually much lower than people wanted to admit, especially for employees who felt undervalued and overworked. $100 here, a recommendation to management there, and suddenly you had someone who would bend rules and overlook policies to keep you happy. The airline's VIP culture was something Christopher understood instantly because it reflected his own worldview. People who paid more deserved more, and people who couldn't afford premium treatment should be grateful for whatever scraps they received. He had platinum status, not because he was a frequent flyer, but because he had learned that the right conversations with the right managers could result in upgrades to elite tiers that came with benefits like priority boarding, complimentary upgrades, and most importantly, gate agents who were motivated to solve problems rather than cite policy. Janet Cruz Blake's supervisor was exactly the kind of middle manager who thrived in this environment because she understood that keeping high-value passengers happy was the path to career advancement, while advocating for fairness or policy adherence was the path to performance improvement plans and eventual termination. She had coached Blake repeatedly about the importance of relationship building with premium passengers, which was corporate speak for bending over backward to accommodate unreasonable demands from people who tipped well and complained loudly when they didn't get their way. The truth was that Christopher didn't particularly like Blake or any of the other service employees who catered to his whims. He simply viewed them as useful tools for getting what he wanted. Blake's eagerness to please and obvious financial desperation made him an easy target for manipulation, and Christopher had already identified him as someone who could be counted on to prioritize immediate gratification over long-term consequences. The young man was struggling with custody issues and money problems, which meant he was vulnerable to the kind of offers that might seem attractive in the moment, but would ultimately compromise his integrity and his job security. During his last flight, Christopher had slipped Blake a $50 bill and mentioned casually that he appreciated exceptional service and always remembered people who went above and beyond. It was a classic manipulation tactic that created a sense of obligation and expectation without explicitly asking for anything illegal or unethical. Blake had responded exactly as expected, processing Christopher's rebooking request with unusual speed and somehow managing to secure an aisle seat in premium economy even though the flight was supposedly sold out. Tonight would be different, though, because Christopher was desperate in a way that made him dangerous. He couldn't afford to miss this flight, couldn't afford to get stuck in Chicago while lawyers and creditors closed in on his remaining assets, and couldn't afford to let some gate agent's adherence to policy stand between him and his escape route. He had brought cash, lots of it, and he was prepared to offer Blake the kind of money that would make following the rules seem foolish and short-sighted. As Christopher approached the gate, he could see Blake looking stressed and distracted, which was perfect for his purposes. Desperate people made desperate decisions, and Christopher was counting on Blake's financial pressure to override whatever moral qualms he might have about helping a passenger skip ahead of other travelers who had legitimate claims to the seats they had paid for. Zara approached the priority access lane with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from knowing exactly where you belong. But Blake Morrison saw something entirely different when he looked up from his computer screen. He saw a young black woman in a hoodie that looked like it came from a discount store carrying a backpack that had seen better days approaching a gate that served passengers who typically wore suits and carried luggage that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Blake's first thought wasn't malicious. It was simply the result of years of conditioning in an industry that had taught him to make quick judgments about passengers based on appearance, attire, and attitude. He had seen hundreds of travelers try to access priority lanes with expired cards, fake boarding passes, or simple confusion about which line they were supposed to use, and his job required him to politely but firmly direct people to the appropriate service level for their ticket type. But as Zara unhooked the velvet rope and stepped onto the red carpet that marked the premium boarding area, Blake felt something shift in his chest that had nothing to do with policy enforcement and everything to do with the kind of unconscious bias that he would have sworn he didn't possess. He saw her hoodie and made assumptions about her economic status, saw her casual attire, and made judgments about her right to be in a space reserved for first-class passengers, and saw her confident demeanor as potential attitude that might become problematic if not handled correctly from the beginning. "Excuse me," Blake said, standing up straighter behind his podium and adopting the tone of polite authority that he had perfected over 5 years of dealing with confused travelers. "Are you sure you're in the right line? Economy check-in is handled at the main counter downstairs." His voice carried just enough condescension to make it clear that he wasn't really asking a question so much as providing gentle correction for what he assumed was an honest mistake. Zara stopped walking and looked at Blake with the kind of measured patience that suggested she had been through this exact scenario before, probably more times than she cared to remember. She pulled her passport from the front pocket of her hoodie along with her boarding pass and placed both documents on the counter without breaking eye contact. "I'm checking in for seat 1A, she said simply. her voice carrying none of the defensiveness or anger that Blake had expected. "Zara Mitchell." Blake took the documents and scanned them quickly, expecting to find some obvious error that would explain why this passenger was trying to access premium services. But when he typed her name into the system, his screen populated with information that didn't match his assumptions. First-class seat assignment paid in full 3 weeks ago with a Centurion Card 5IP status that automatically triggered priority handling, and a passenger profile that indicated multiple previous flights in premium cabins. For a smart employee, this would have been the moment to apologize for the misunderstanding, print the boarding pass, and send Zara on her way with a smile and a sincere wish for a pleasant flight. But Blake Morrison was dealing with pressures that had nothing to do with smart decision-making and everything to do with desperation, financial stress, and a worldview that had been shaped by an industry that rewarded him for keeping certain types of passengers happy, while treating others as potential problems to be managed. Instead of processing the obvious truth in front of him, Blake found himself experiencing the kind of cognitive dissonance that happens when reality doesn't match expectations. He stared at the screen, then at Zara, then back at the screen, trying to reconcile the information showing a legitimate first-class passenger with the visual evidence of a young woman who didn't look like his mental image of someone who could afford a $3,000 last-minute international ticket. "There seems to be some kind of error with your payment," Blake said finally, the lie coming so easily that he almost believed it himself. "I'm showing a decline on the card that was used to purchase this ticket." It was the kind of fabrication that gave him a few minutes to think, a few moments to figure out how to handle a situation that his training had never prepared him for, what to do when your biases and your computer system told completely different stories. Zara's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes sharpened in a way that suggested she understood exactly what was happening and exactly why Blake was choosing to lie, rather than admit his mistake. "That's interesting," she said, her voice still calm but carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. "Because I received confirmation that the payment processed successfully 3 weeks ago, and I have the receipt right here in my email if you'd like to verify the transaction." Blake could feel himself digging a hole that was getting deeper with every word, but he had committed to the lie now, and backing down would mean admitting that he had judged this passenger based on her appearance and made assumptions that had nothing to do with her actual ticket status. Instead, he doubled down, telling himself that he was just being thorough, just following procedure, just making sure that everything was legitimate before processing a high-value passenger through the system. "I'm going to need to call our customer service department to verify this payment," Blake said, reaching for his phone in a performance of diligence that he hoped would buy him enough time to figure out his next move. But before he could dial, Christopher Harwick appeared at Zara's shoulder like a bad omen, carrying the smell of expensive cologne and the kind of entitled energy that made Blake's customer service instincts immediately shift into accommodating mode. "Is there a problem here?" Christopher asked, his voice carrying the tone of someone who expected problems to disappear simply because he had acknowledged their existence. He looked past Zara as if she were a piece of furniture that had been placed in his way, focusing his attention entirely on Blake. "I hope we're not looking at delays because I have connections to make and timing is absolutely critical tonight." Blake felt the familiar surge of anxiety that came with disappointing a premium passenger, especially one who had been generous during previous interactions, and who clearly had the kind of influence that could result in commendation letters or complaint calls, depending on how well their needs were managed. Christopher represented everything that Blake had been trained to prioritize: status, repeat business, and the kind of passenger satisfaction that translated directly into job security and performance bonuses. "Mr. Harwick," Blake said, his entire demeanor shifting as he recognized the platinum-level passenger who had specifically requested excellent service. "No delays at all, sir. Just working through a small verification issue with another passenger's ticket. I'll have you processed and on your way in just a moment." Zara watched this interaction with the kind of detached interest that comes from understanding exactly how power dynamics work in spaces that were never designed with people like her in mind. She had seen this movie before, had watched service employees transform their entire personality when faced with different types of customers, had learned that her money was perfectly good when she was spending it, but somehow became questionable when she tried to claim the services that money had purchased. Actually, Zara said, her voice cutting through Christopher's complaints about weather delays and connection concerns. I think we should resolve my verification issue first, since I was here before Mr. Harwick arrived. It was a reasonable request, delivered in a professional tone, but Blake heard it as a challenge to his authority and an attempt to prioritize her needs over those of a passenger who mattered more to his job security and financial stability. Christopher looked at Zara for the first time since approaching the counter, his eyes taking in her hoodie, her backpack, and her general appearance with the kind of dismissive assessment that suggested he had already decided she wasn't worth his time or attention. I'm sure whatever issue you're having can wait, he said, his voice carrying the casual arrogance of someone who had never been told that his needs weren't more important than everyone else's. This gentleman and I have business to conduct. Blake found himself at a crossroads that would define not only the rest of his evening, but the rest of his life. He could follow policy process Zara's legitimate ticket and send both passengers on their way with equal respect and professional courtesy. Or he could prioritize Christopher's demands, find a way to remove Zara from the equation, and hope that the immediate benefits of keeping a premium passenger happy would somehow outweigh the long-term consequences of discriminating against a paying customer who had done nothing wrong except fail to meet his visual expectations of what a first-class passenger should look like. The decision he made next would cost him everything. Blake Morrison made his choice in the space between heartbeats in that terrible moment when desperation overwhelmed judgment and financial pressure silenced the voice in his head that knew right from wrong. He looked at Zara standing patiently with her legitimate boarding pass and confirmed reservation, and he looked at Christopher Harwick fidgeting with expensive jewelry and radiating the kind of impatience that could result in complaint calls and performance reviews. And he chose the path that he thought would protect his job, his custody arrangement, and his ability to pay for his mother's medical care. Ma'am, Blake said, his voice taking on the formal tone that service employees use when they're about to deliver bad news. I've confirmed that there is indeed an issue with your payment method. The card you used to purchase this ticket has been flagged by our fraud prevention system, and I'm afraid I can't process your boarding pass until we can verify the payment with an alternative method. And the lie came out smoothly practiced and professional, the kind of corporate doublespeak that shifted blame away from the airline and onto the passenger, while providing just enough technical jargon to sound legitimate. Zara blinked slowly, and Blake could see her processing not just his words, but the situation she found herself in, the familiar dance of being asked to prove her worth in spaces where her presence was questioned before her credentials. That's strange, she said, pulling out her phone and opening her banking app with deliberate calm. Because according to my account, the payment cleared 3 weeks ago and I received email confirmation of the transaction. Would you like me to show you the confirmation number? Christopher shifted his weight from foot to foot, checking his expensive watch with theatrical impatience. Look, I don't mean to interrupt whatever this is, he said, though his tone suggested that interrupting was exactly what he intended to do. But I really need to get checked in here. I have a very tight connection in London, and timing is absolutely critical tonight. Can we move this along? Blake felt the familiar pressure that came with disappointing a VIP passenger, the weight of knowing that Christopher's satisfaction would be measured and reported while Zara's experience would likely disappear into the anonymous mass of customer interactions that nobody tracked unless something went spectacularly wrong. Of course, Mr. Harwick, Blake said, his attention turning away from Zara as if she had suddenly become invisible. I just need to resolve this payment issue and then I'll get you processed immediately. What payment issue? Zara asked, her voice still controlled but carrying an edge that suggested her patience was not unlimited. I've offered to show you the confirmation email, the bank statement, and the credit card itself. What exactly do you need to verify? She placed her phone on the counter, the banking app open to show a transaction history that clearly included the British Airways charge processed and completed without any flags or issues. Blake barely glanced at the phone. He had committed to his lie now, and doubling down seemed easier than admitting that he had made a mistake based on assumptions that had nothing to do with policy or procedure. "Our fraud prevention system operates independently of your bank's authorization," he said, speaking with the confidence of someone who had learned that technical explanations could justify almost anything if delivered with enough authority. "Until I can verify this payment through our internal channels, I'm not authorized to issue a boarding pass for this reservation." 30. The gate area was starting to fill with passengers, and Blake could see other travelers beginning to notice the tension at the premium counter. A military veteran in dress blues stood nearby, his expression suggesting that he was taking in every word of the conversation. A young mother with 2 small children was trying to keep them entertained while obviously listening to the dispute unfolding in front of her. A businessman in an expensive suit was typing on his laptop, but glancing up frequently, his attention divided between his work and the drama playing out at the gate. Zara looked around at the growing audience and made a decision that Blake would later realize was his last chance to avoid the disaster that was about to unfold. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," she said, her voice carrying the tone of someone who was offering him an opportunity to save face and correct his mistake. "I'm happy to step aside and let you help other passengers while you look into whatever technical issue you think you're seeing. But I want to be clear that my reservation is valid, my payment processed correctly, and I expect to board this flight tonight." It was a reasonable request that acknowledged Blake's authority while preserving Zara's dignity, the kind of compromise that experienced travelers learn to offer when they recognize that service employees are under pressure and need room to maneuver. But Blake had already moved past the point where reasonable solutions were possible, had already convinced himself that admitting error would be worse than doubling down on deception, had already decided that Zara's calm professionalism was somehow a threat to his ability to manage the situation. Christopher, sensing an opportunity to assert himself and speed up the process, stepped forward and placed his hand on the counter in a gesture that managed to be both casual and possessive. "Honestly, Blake, if this passenger's payment is questionable, why don't you just move her aside and deal with the problem later? I've got confirmed reservations and a platinum card that you know is good, and I really can't afford to miss this connection." His voice carried the tone of someone offering helpful advice, but his suggestion was actually a demand disguised as a reasonable solution. Blake felt something shift inside him as he realized that Christopher was offering him an escape from the corner he had painted himself into. Instead of having to prove that Zara's payment was fraudulent, he could simply prioritize Christopher's legitimate status and deal with the technical issue later, after the premium passenger was safely on his way and no longer a factor in Blake's performance evaluation. "You know what?" Blake said, his voice taking on the tone of someone who had just found a creative solution to a difficult problem. "That's exactly right. Mr. Harwick, why don't I get you processed first since your status is confirmed and your connection is time-sensitive, ma'am? If you could just step aside for a moment, I'll be able to give your issue the attention it deserves once I've taken care of our platinum passenger." Zara stared at Blake for a long moment, and he could see her understanding exactly what was happening, exactly what decision he had just made, and exactly what it meant about who he thought deserved respect and who could be safely ignored. "So you're saying that Mr. Harwick's time is more valuable than mine?" she asked, her voice still calm but carrying a weight that made Blake suddenly aware that other passengers were listening to every word of this conversation. "I'm saying that we prioritize passengers based on their status level and the urgency of their travel needs," Blake replied, using the kind of corporate language that turned discrimination into policy and bias into procedure. "Mr. Harwick is a platinum member with a confirmed connection, and our service standards require that we accommodate our highest-tier passengers first during irregular operations." Christopher smiled with the satisfaction of someone whose worldview had just been validated by official policy. "I appreciate that, Blake. Excellent customer service as always." He pulled out his phone to check his messages, dismissing Zara's presence entirely as he settled in to wait for Blake to process his boarding pass and seat assignment. But Zara wasn't ready to disappear quietly into the background. Wasn't willing to accept that her confirmed reservation could be invalidated by lies, and her legitimate status could be overridden by someone else's sense of entitlement. She pulled out her own phone and opened the camera app, holding it up to record the interaction with the kind of deliberate calm that suggested she understood the power of documentation in situations where her word would be questioned against that of authority figures. "I want to make sure I understand this correctly," she said, her voice carrying clearly as the phone's microphone picked up every word. "You're telling me that my confirmed first-class reservation, paid for in full 3 weeks ago, is being revoked because of a payment issue that you can't specify, and you're giving my seat to Mr. Harwick here because he has better status than I do." Blake felt a chill run down his spine as he realized that this conversation was being recorded, that his words and actions were being preserved in a format that could be shared, reviewed, and used as evidence of whatever discrimination case Zara might choose to build against the airline. But he was too far into the lie to back down now, too committed to the deception to admit that he had been wrong from the beginning, too afraid of losing face in front of Christopher to do the right thing even when it was being filmed. "Ma'am, you need to put that phone away," Blake said, his voice taking on an edge of authority that he hoped would intimidate Zara into compliance. "Recording gate operations without permission is a violation of airport security protocols." It was another lie, but it was the kind of lie that sounded official enough to justify almost anything, and Blake was counting on Zara's unfamiliarity with actual security regulations to make her back down. Instead, Zara continued recording her expression, never changing as she captured Blake's escalating attempts to justify his actions and Christopher's smug satisfaction at being prioritized over a passenger who had done nothing wrong except fail to look like someone who belonged in first class. That was when Blake made the decision that would destroy his life. He reached across the counter and slapped the phone out of Zara's hand. The sound of Zara's phone hitting the marble floor echoed through the gate area like a gunshot, and for a moment that felt frozen in time. Everyone within 50 feet stopped what they were doing and turned to stare at Blake Morrison, who stood behind his counter with his hand still extended and his face showing a mixture of shock and defiance that suggested he couldn't quite believe what he had just done. Zara looked down at her phone, its screen now decorated with a spider web of cracks that ran from corner to corner, then back up at Blake with an expression that was somehow more terrifying than anger would have been. It was the look of someone who had just watched another person reveal their true character in the most definitive way possible, someone who now understood exactly what kind of man she was dealing with, and exactly how far he was willing to go to maintain his sense of authority. "Did you just hit my phone?" Zara asked, her voice carrying the kind of deadly calm that should have warned Blake that he was standing at the edge of a cliff and about to take a very long fall. "Did you just physically strike my personal property because I was recording your customer service?" The military veteran in dress blues stepped forward, his posture straightening as years of training kicked in at the sight of what looked like assault being committed in front of him. "Ma'am, I saw what happened," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades dealing with conflicts and recognizing injustice when he saw it. "This agent just hit your phone out of your hand." "That's not legal, and it's certainly not appropriate." Christopher Harwick, who had been enjoying the show up until this point, suddenly realized that the situation had escalated beyond his comfort level, and that being associated with what was clearly becoming a discrimination incident might not be the best look for someone trying to maintain a low profile while fleeing the country. "Blake, maybe we should all just calm down here," he said, though his tone suggested that he was more concerned about delays than justice. "I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding that we can resolve quickly." Blake felt the walls closing in around him as he realized that his attempt to control the situation had only made it worse, that his lie about payment issues had led to physical confrontation, and that he was now facing a gate full of witnesses who had seen him assault a passenger's property for the crime of documenting his discriminatory behavior. But instead of apologizing and trying to salvage what was left of his career and dignity, Blake felt something dark and desperate take control of his decision-making process. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step back," Blake said to the veteran, his voice taking on the aggressive tone that authority figures use when they're losing control and trying to regain it through intimidation. "This is an airline matter, and passenger interference is not appropriate." He turned back to Zara, his expression hardening into something ugly. "And you need to understand that assaulting airline personnel is a federal crime, and continuing to disrupt operations will result in your removal from this terminal." The accusation was so outrageous, so completely disconnected from what had actually happened, that several passengers gasped audibly. The young mother with 2 children pulled them closer to her, recognizing that the situation was spiraling into something dangerous and unpredictable. The businessman with the laptop closed it entirely and stood up, his body language suggesting that he was preparing to intervene if things got any worse. Zara bent down slowly and picked up her damaged phone, examining the cracked screen with the kind of clinical interest that suggested she was memorizing every detail for future reference. When she stood back up, her entire demeanor had changed, and Blake found himself looking into the eyes of someone who had just decided that patience and diplomacy were no longer appropriate responses to what she was experiencing. "Let me make sure I understand what just happened," Zara said, her voice carrying clearly throughout the gate area as passengers continued to gather and listen. "You lied about my payment status to deny me access to the seat I paid for. You prioritized another passenger's convenience over my confirmed reservation. You physically destroyed my property when I tried to document your behavior, and now you're accusing me of assault for standing here and asking for the service I purchased." Christopher, who had been watching this exchange with growing unease, suddenly realized that his escape route was in jeopardy, and that Blake's incompetence might cost him the flight that he desperately needed to catch. He made a decision that would prove to be just as destructive as Blake's lies, leaning forward and lowering his voice in a way that suggested confidential communication. "Blake, listen to me," Christopher said, his tone urgent but quiet. "I need to be on this flight tonight. It's not just a preference. It's absolutely critical for business reasons that I can't explain. If there's any way you can resolve this situation and get me processed, I'm prepared to show my appreciation for exceptional service." He reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope that was clearly thick with cash. "I'm talking about serious gratitude here, the kind that helps with child support payments and medical bills." Blake stared at the envelope, his mind racing with calculations about mortgage payments, custody lawyers, and the insulin that his mother needed to stay alive. $3,000 in cash would solve problems that his airline salary couldn't touch, would buy him breathing room in a life that felt like it was suffocating him with financial pressure and impossible choices. But taking the money would mean crossing a line from poor customer service into outright corruption, from unconscious bias into deliberate fraud, from bad judgment into criminal behavior. Blake looked at Christopher's expectant face, then at Zara's damaged phone, then at the envelope full of cash, and he made the decision that would complete his transformation from a struggling employee into a federal criminal. "You know what?" Blake said, reaching for the envelope with shaking hands. "I think I can find a creative solution here." He pocketed the cash quickly and turned back to his computer, his fingers flying over the keyboard as he began the process of transferring Zara's seat assignment to Christopher's name. "Mr. Harwick, I'm going to get you set up in seat 1A, and we'll figure out alternative arrangements for this other passenger once we've taken care of your immediate needs." The veteran in dress blues stepped forward again, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent his career fighting for the principles that Blake was now destroying. Son, I don't know what's in that envelope, but what you just did was accept a bribe to deny service to a paying customer. That's not a customer service issue. That's a crime. Blake's hands were shaking as he printed Christopher's boarding pass, the paper emerging from the machine, like evidence of his corruption, like a receipt for the soul he had just sold for $3,000, and the promise of keeping a premium passenger satisfied. Sir, I'm going to need you to return to your seat and allow me to do my job, Blake said, though his voice lacked any real authority now that everyone watching understood exactly what kind of job he was actually doing. Zara watched this entire exchange with the kind of detached fascination that comes from witnessing someone destroy their own life in real time, from seeing the exact moment when bad choices become irreversible consequences. She reached into her backpack and pulled out a second phone, a satellite device that looked different from anything the gathered passengers had seen before, and began dialing a number that she clearly knew by heart. "What are you doing?" Blake asked, his voice cracking as he realized that Zara had backup communication options and that his destruction of her first phone had accomplished nothing except providing evidence of his willingness to use physical force against passengers who challenged his authority. "I'm making a phone call," Zara said, her voice carrying the kind of calm certainty that suggested she was no longer operating as a frustrated passenger, but as someone with access to resources and influence that Blake had seriously underestimated. "You might want to pay attention to this conversation, Blake, because I think it's going to change your perspective on exactly who you've been treating like a nobody tonight." As the call connected and Zara began speaking in the kind of authoritative tone that comes from being accustomed to immediate compliance and total respect, Blake Morrison felt the first genuine stirrings of fear as he realized that he might have just accepted a bribe to discriminate against someone who had the power to destroy not just his career, but his freedom. Officer Marcus Davis had been working airport security for 12 years, and in that time he had seen every possible variation of passenger meltdown, employee breakdown, and travel-related disaster that the human imagination could produce. He had talked suicide jumpers down from parking garage ledges, subdued, intoxicated travelers who thought that first-class tickets gave them the right to assault flight crews, and mediated disputes between passengers that ranged from seat assignments to service animals to political arguments that somehow became physical altercations at 30,000 feet. But when Blake Morrison's panicked voice came through his radio requesting immediate assistance at Gate B12, something in the young man's tone suggested that this was going to be different from the usual complaints about overbooked flights and delayed departures. Blake sounded scared, desperate, and increasingly incoherent as he described a passenger who was making threats and refusing to comply with airline policies in ways that seemed to justify emergency intervention. Davis arrived at the gate to find a crowd of passengers who were clearly divided into two camps: those who seemed uncomfortable with what they had witnessed and those who appeared to be documenting everything with their phones held high like digital torches in some kind of modern witch trial. At the center of the disturbance stood Blake Morrison, sweating profusely despite the air conditioning, and a young black woman who radiated the kind of controlled fury that Davis had learned to recognize as far more dangerous than screaming or crying. "Officer Davis, thank God you're here," Blake said, his voice cracking with relief as he gestured toward Zara with hands that shook from either adrenaline or guilt. "This passenger has been disruptive and threatening, and she's recording our security procedures without authorization. I need her removed from the gate area before she causes any more problems with other travelers." Davis looked at Zara, who was standing perfectly still with a satellite phone pressed to her ear, speaking in low tones that carried the unmistakable cadence of someone accustomed to giving orders rather than taking them. She wasn't yelling, wasn't gesturing wildly, wasn't exhibiting any of the behaviors that Davis associated with disruptive passengers, but Blake seemed convinced that she represented some kind of threat that justified immediate removal. "Ma'am, I'm Officer Davis with Airport Security," he said. approaching Zara with the cautious professionalism that comes from years of de-escalating situations where everyone believes they're right and everyone else is crazy. I understand there's been some kind of disagreement about your travel arrangements. Can you help me understand what's happening here? Zara held up one finger in a gesture that was clearly meant to indicate that she was finishing her phone call, and Davis could hear fragments of her conversation that included phrases like authorization code and immediate response and federal jurisdiction that suggested she wasn't calling her family to complain about poor customer service. Christopher Harwick, who had been standing nearby with his boarding pass clutched in his hand like a golden ticket, suddenly realized that the situation was attracting far more attention than he was comfortable with, and that being associated with what looked increasingly like a discrimination incident might complicate his travel plans in ways that could prove disastrous for his escape timeline. "Officer, I really don't think this is necessary," Christopher said, his voice taking on the concerned tone of someone who was trying to be helpful while actually protecting himself. "Mr. Morrison here was just doing his job trying to verify this passenger's payment information. Maybe we could just move things along and let everyone get where they need to go without any more drama." The military veteran who had witnessed Blake's assault on Zara's phone stepped forward, his dress blues giving him the kind of moral authority that made his words carry extra weight in situations where truth was being disputed. "Officer, I need you to know that this gate agent physically struck this woman's phone out of her hand when she tried to record what appeared to be discriminatory treatment. I saw it happen, and I'll testify to that fact if necessary." Blake's face went white as he realized that his version of events was about to be contradicted by someone whose credibility would be taken seriously by law enforcement. "That's not what happened," he said, his voice rising with desperation. "She was threatening me and interfering with security procedures. I was trying to protect other passengers from a disruptive individual who was creating a scene." Several other passengers began speaking at once, their voices overlapping as they tried to provide their own accounts of what they had witnessed. The young mother with 2 children described seeing Blake lie about payment issues. The businessman with the laptop mentioned observing what looked like a cash transaction between Blake and Christopher, and an elderly couple near the back of the group talked about hearing discriminatory language being used to justify treating passengers differently based on their appearance. Davis held up his hand to quiet the crowd, recognizing that he was dealing with a situation that had clearly escalated beyond a simple customer service dispute and into territory that might require federal intervention rather than local security management. "Everyone, please step back and let me talk to the principals involved here," he said, though his tone suggested that he was beginning to understand that Blake's version of events might not be entirely accurate. Zara finished her phone call and turned to face Davis with the kind of calm authority that made him immediately revise his assessment of who was actually in control of this situation. "Officer Davis, my name is Zara Mitchell, and I need to inform you that you're about to witness what may be one of the most expensive cases of customer service discrimination in aviation history." "I'm sorry," Davis said, his training telling him to remain neutral while his instincts suggested that this woman knew something that nobody else in the area understood yet. "Blake Morrison here has just accepted a cash bribe to deny me access to the first-class seat that I purchased legally and confirmed weeks ago." Zara said, her voice carrying clearly throughout the gate area as she spoke with the confidence of someone presenting evidence in a courtroom. "He lied about payment issues, physically destroyed my property when I tried to document his behavior, and is now attempting to have me arrested for the crime of insisting on receiving the service I paid for." Blake started to protest, but Zara held up her hand in a gesture that somehow commanded immediate silence from everyone present. "But here's what Mr. Morrison doesn't understand yet." She continued, reaching into her backpack and pulling out a folder thick with legal documents. "The phone call I just made was to the Federal Aviation Administration's emergency response line using authorization codes that are only given to people with federal security clearance and direct oversight authority over airport operations. Davis felt a chill run down his spine as he began to understand that this wasn't just a passenger complaint, but potentially a federal incident involving someone with the kind of access and authority that could make everyone involved wish they had chosen different careers. "Ma'am, are you saying you work for the FAA?" he asked, though something in her demeanor suggested that her authority might extend far beyond any single government agency. "I'm saying that as of 4:23 p.m. today, I became the majority owner of Horizon Infrastructure Group, which holds the operational lease for Terminal 3 of Chicago O'Hare International Airport," Zara said, opening the folder and displaying documents that were clearly official, legal, and very recently executed. Blake Morrison just accepted a bribe to discriminate against his landlord. The silence that followed this revelation was so complete that Davis could hear the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of aircraft engines from the tarmac outside. Blake Morrison stared at the documents in Zara's hands, his mouth opening and closing without any sound emerging, while Christopher Harwick took an involuntary step backward as he realized that his escape plan had just collided with someone who owned the building they were standing in. "You're telling me," Davis said slowly, as the implications of what he was hearing began to sink in, "that this passenger owns the terminal." "I'm telling you," Zara replied, "that in about 3 minutes every emergency vehicle at this airport is going to converge on this gate, and that the aircraft Mr. Harwick is hoping to board is not going anywhere until federal investigators determine whether we're looking at simple discrimination or something much more serious involving bribery and fraud." As if summoned by her words, the sound of sirens began to echo through the terminal, growing louder and more insistent with each passing second, while Blake Morrison and Christopher Harwick realized that their lives were about to change in ways that would make their current problems seem like minor inconveniences. The satellite phone in Zara Mitchell's hand looked like something from a spy movie, all black metal and extended antenna, and the kind of serious functionality that suggested it was designed for people who needed to communicate regardless of circumstances, distance, or the availability of conventional cellular networks. When she had pulled it from her backpack and begun dialing with the confidence of someone who knew the number by heart, Blake Morrison had assumed she was calling a lawyer or maybe customer service at some credit card company to dispute the charges she claimed had been processed correctly. He had no way of knowing that Zara was actually calling the Emergency Operations Center at the Federal Aviation Administration, using authorization codes that connected her directly to the night supervisor who handled security incidents involving potential threats to aviation safety, or that the conversation he was about to overhear would trigger response protocols that were typically reserved for terrorist incidents and hijacking attempts. "This is Zara Mitchell authorization code, Alpha 9, Victor 74, she said into the phone, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone who expected immediate recognition and total compliance with her requests. "I need to report a Code Orange security breach at Chicago, O'Hare Terminal 3, Gate B12. We have confirmed bribery of airline personnel and potential compromise of passenger manifest integrity." Blake felt his stomach drop as he heard words like security breach and bribery spoken in the same sentence as his location and his actions. But he was still telling himself that this was all some kind of elaborate bluff by a disgruntled passenger who was trying to intimidate him into giving her special treatment. The idea that the woman in the hoodie could have the kind of access and authority she was claiming seemed impossible to reconcile with his assumptions about what powerful people looked like and how they behaved. "Confirmed I need immediate response from Airport Police Federal Air Marshal Service and TSA security oversight." Zara continued, her voice never wavering as she provided coordinates and details with the precision of someone who had clearly been through this kind of protocol before. "Passenger manifest has been compromised for Flight 847 to London Heathrow, and we have evidence of cash payments being made to airline personnel in exchange for preferential treatment." Christopher Harwick, who had been feeling smug and satisfied about his successful bribery of Blake Morrison just moments earlier, suddenly realized that his $3,000 investment in preferential treatment might have been the worst financial decision of his life. The escape route that was supposed to take him away from his legal troubles in Chicago was suddenly looking like a trap that would connect him to federal crimes that carried much more serious penalties than the bankruptcy and gambling debts he was trying to avoid. "Officer Davis?" Christopher said, his voice taking on the nervous tone of someone who was trying to distance himself from a situation that was rapidly spiraling out of control. "I want to make it clear that I was simply requesting expedited service and that any gratuity I may have offered was intended as appreciation for exceptional customer service, not as any kind of improper inducement." Davis looked at Christopher with the expression of a man who had just watched someone try to walk back a confession that had been witnessed by dozens of people. "Sir, are you saying you did or didn't give money to this gate agent?" he asked, though the answer was obvious to everyone who had been paying attention to the conversation over the past 20 minutes. Blake Morrison felt panic rising in his chest as he realized that his acceptance of Christopher's bribe had been observed and documented by multiple witnesses, that his lies about Zara's payment status were about to be exposed as deliberate discrimination, and that the woman he had been treating like a nuisance had somehow triggered a federal response that would scrutinize every decision he had made during his shift tonight. "I want to be clear that any money I may have received was offered voluntarily by Mr. Harwick as a tip for good service," Blake said, his voice shaking as he tried to construct a legal defense that would explain away behavior that was clearly illegal, regardless of how it was characterized. "There was no quid pro quo arrangement, and I was simply trying to accommodate a platinum-level passenger during irregular operations." Zara lowered her phone and looked at Blake with the expression of someone who was about to deliver news that would fundamentally change his understanding of the situation he had created for himself. "Blake, I need you to understand something very important," she said, her voice carrying the patient tone that teachers use when explaining concepts to students who haven't been paying attention. "When you accepted money to deny me service, you didn't just discriminate against a passenger. You took a bribe to discriminate against the person who owns the building you work in." The words hung in the air like a death sentence, and Blake could feel the weight of their implications crushing down on him as he began to understand that his financial desperation had led him to commit federal crimes against someone with the resources and authority to ensure that those crimes were prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Officer Davis stepped forward, his hand moving instinctively toward his handcuffs as his training kicked in, and he began to process the fact that he was potentially dealing with federal crimes that were outside his jurisdiction, but definitely within his responsibility to secure until appropriate authorities could take control. "Ma'am, are you saying that you have ownership authority over this terminal?" he asked, though the sirens that were growing louder by the minute suggested that her claims were being taken seriously by people with much more security clearance than a local airport police officer. "I'm saying that as of this afternoon, Horizon Infrastructure Group, which I own and control, acquired the operational lease for all ground services, gate assignments, and retail operations in Terminal 3. Zara replied, pulling additional documents from her folder and spreading them across Blake's counter like evidence in a trial. These documents were filed with the city of Chicago at 4:23 p.m. today, making me Blake's landlord as well as the passenger he just tried to defraud. The sound of heavy vehicles moving at high speed across the tarmac was now clearly audible through the terminal windows, and passengers throughout the gate area were pressing against the glass to see what looked like a convoy of emergency response vehicles racing toward their location. Black SUVs with federal license plates, airport police cars with lights flashing, and what appeared to be unmarked vehicles carrying people in tactical gear were converging on the area outside Gate B12 with the kind of coordinated precision that suggested this was not a routine security response. Christopher Harwick stared at the approaching vehicles and felt his carefully planned escape route disintegrating before his eyes as he realized that his attempt to bribe his way onto a flight had instead connected him to federal crimes involving someone with the kind of power and resources that could make his current legal troubles seem like minor inconveniences. "This is insane," he said, his voice cracking with panic. "I just wanted to get on a plane. I had no idea who this woman was supposed to be." The beautiful thing about discrimination, Zara said, looking at Christopher with the expression of someone who was delivering a lesson that had been a long time coming, is that it reveals exactly who you are regardless of who your target happens to be. You didn't try to bribe Blake because you knew I owned the terminal. You did it because you thought I was nobody, and nobody's needs could be safely ignored for your convenience. Blake Morrison watched the emergency vehicles positioning themselves around the aircraft and felt the full weight of his choices settling on his shoulders like a crushing burden as he realized that his $3,000 bribe had just cost him his career, his freedom, and quite possibly his relationship with his son, who would have to grow up knowing that his father had become a federal criminal because he was too weak to do the right thing when it mattered most. The terminal doors burst open, and what looked like a small army of federal agents, airport police, and security personnel began moving toward Gate B12 with the kind of purposeful intensity that suggested they had been briefed on a situation that involved much more than a simple customer service complaint. Director Patricia Morse had been managing emergency operations at O'Hare International Airport for 15 years. And in that time she had responded to everything from natural disasters to terrorist threats, to the kind of mechanical failures that required evacuating entire terminals and grounding every aircraft within a 100-mile radius. But when the call came through on her secure line at 7:23 p.m. on New Year's Eve, reporting a code orange security breach involving potential compromise of passenger manifests and confirmed bribery of airline personnel, she knew immediately that this was going to be different from anything in her previous experience. The authorization codes that Zara Mitchell had provided were the kind that belonged to people with federal security clearance and direct oversight authority over aviation infrastructure. The kind of access that was only granted to individuals whose background investigations had been conducted by agencies that didn't officially exist, and whose business interests were considered matters of national security. When Morse pulled up Mitchell's file on her secure terminal, she had to read the summary 3 times before she fully understood the implications of what was happening at Gate B12. Zara Mitchell wasn't just wealthy. She was the kind of wealthy that influenced elections and shaped foreign policy through infrastructure investments that connected American power grids to international markets. Horizon Infrastructure Group didn't just manage electrical systems and internet backbone across 17 states. It held contracts with the Pentagon and the State Department for projects that were classified at levels that required special clearance just to acknowledge their existence. And as of 4:23 p.m. that afternoon, this woman had acquired operational control over one of the busiest international terminals in the American aviation system. The fact that some gate agent named Blake Morrison had accepted a bribe to discriminate against her was bad enough from a public relations standpoint. But the security implications of denying access to someone with her clearance levels and infrastructure authority raised questions that went far beyond customer service complaints, and into territory that involved federal agencies whose acronyms most people had never heard of. Director Morse's response team consisted of 6 federal air marshals, 12 airport police officers, 4 TSA security specialists, and 2 agents from an alphabet soup agency that handled situations involving threats to critical infrastructure. They moved through Terminal 3 with the kind of coordinated precision that comes from years of training for scenarios that most people prefer not to think about, and their presence immediately transformed the atmosphere at Gate B12 from a customer service dispute into something that looked like a scene from a political thriller. Blake Morrison watched this army of law enforcement approaching his gate and felt his last shred of hope evaporating as he began to understand that his lies about payment issues and his acceptance of Christopher Harwick's bribe had somehow triggered a federal response that suggested Zara Mitchell was exactly who she claimed to be, and possibly much more important than even her ownership of the terminal would indicate. Blake Morrison, employee ID 4922-Bravo, Director Morse asked as she approached his counter, though her tone suggested that this was not really a question so much as a confirmation of details that had already been verified through channels that Blake didn't have access to. "Yes, ma'am." Blake said, his voice barely above a whisper, as he realized that his career was over and his freedom was about to become a matter for federal prosecutors rather than airline human resources departments. "You are relieved of duty effective immediately." Morse continued, gesturing for two airport police officers to position themselves on either side of Blake's workstation. "Your security clearance is suspended pending investigation, and you are not to access any airline computer systems or passenger information databases until further notice." Christopher Harwick tried to edge away from the counter as he realized that being associated with Blake's criminal behavior might complicate his own legal situation in ways that extended far beyond his original bankruptcy and gambling problems. "Director, I want to make it clear that I was simply requesting expedited service," he said, though his voice lacked conviction as he watched federal agents taking photographs of the cash-filled envelope that was still visible in Blake's jacket pocket. "Mr. Harwick, you are not free to leave this area," one of the federal air marshals said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who was accustomed to immediate compliance with his instructions. "We have questions about your travel arrangements and the nature of your financial transaction with airline personnel." Zara watched this unfolding with the satisfaction of someone who had endured years of discrimination and bias and finally found herself in a position to ensure that the consequences for such behavior were immediate, comprehensive, and impossible to ignore. She approached Director Morse with the confidence of someone who was used to being the most important person in any room she entered, regardless of how many federal agents and law enforcement officers happened to be present. "Director Morse, I appreciate the rapid response," Zara said, her voice carrying the tone of someone who was accustomed to receiving excellent service from government agencies that most citizens never interact with directly. "I trust that this incident will be thoroughly investigated and that appropriate measures will be taken to ensure that discrimination of this nature doesn't happen again in facilities under my operational control." "Absolutely, Ms. Mitchell," Director Morse replied, her tone suggesting that Zara's concerns would be treated with the kind of priority typically reserved for matters of national importance. "We're treating this as a potential violation of federal aviation security protocols as well as civil rights legislation, and I can assure you that both Mr. Morrison and Mr. Harwick will face appropriate consequences for their actions." Blake Morrison listened to this conversation with growing horror as he realized that his moment of weakness, his decision to accept a bribe and lie about a passenger's payment status, had somehow escalated into a federal case involving someone whose influence extended far beyond anything he had imagined possible. The $3,000 in his pocket, which had seemed like a solution to his financial problems just an hour ago, now felt like evidence of the worst decision he had ever made in his life. "I want to speak to a lawyer," Blake said, his voice cracking as he realized that he was going to need legal representation for crimes that could result in years in federal prison, rather than simply losing his job at the airline. "That's your right," Director Morse replied, gesturing for the airport police officers to begin the process of securing Blake's workstation and collecting evidence that would be turned over to federal prosecutors. "But I want you to understand that accepting bribes to commit discrimination in federal aviation facilities carries mandatory minimum sentences that lawyers can't negotiate away." Christopher Harwick felt panic rising in his chest as he realized that his attempt to escape his legal troubles in Chicago had instead connected him to federal crimes that would attract much more attention from law enforcement agencies than his bankruptcy, fraud, and gambling debts ever could. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice rising with desperation. "I just gave the man a tip for good service. Since when is that illegal?" "Since you offered it in exchange for denying service to another passenger based on her race and appearance," one of the federal air marshals replied. "That's not a tip, Mr. Harwick. That's a conspiracy to commit civil rights violations in a federal facility." The crowd of passengers who had gathered to watch this drama unfold was now being organized and questioned by law enforcement officers who were taking statements and collecting contact information from everyone who had witnessed Blake's lies about Zara's payment status, his physical destruction of her property, and his acceptance of Christopher's cash payment. The military veteran in dress blues was giving a detailed account of everything he had observed, while the young mother with 2 children and the businessman with the laptop were providing their own descriptions of behavior that was clearly discriminatory and potentially criminal. Zara looked around at the scene she had triggered with a single phone call and felt the kind of satisfaction that comes from having the resources and authority to ensure that injustice has immediate and meaningful consequences. For too many years, she had been forced to accept discrimination with quiet dignity, to prove her worth repeatedly in spaces where her presence was questioned, and to navigate systems that were designed to exclude people who looked like her, regardless of their qualifications or financial resources. But tonight, for the first time in her life, she had been in a position to ensure that the people who chose to discriminate against her faced consequences that matched the severity of their actions. Blake Morrison and Christopher Harwick had revealed their true characters when they thought they were dealing with someone powerless, and now they were about to learn that power comes in many forms, and that assuming someone is, nobody can be the most expensive mistake a person ever makes. As federal agents began the process of securing evidence and interviewing witnesses, and as Blake Morrison was led away in handcuffs, while Christopher Harwick was detained for questioning about his travel arrangements and financial transactions, Zara Mitchell finally walked toward the jet bridge to board the flight she had paid for, carrying the knowledge that she had just changed the lives of 2 men who had thought that $3,000 was enough to buy the right to treat another human being as less than worthy of basic respect and dignity. Flight 847 to London Heathrow had been scheduled to depart at 8:15 p.m., but by 9:30 p.m. it was still sitting at the gate while federal agents processed what had become one of the most thoroughly documented cases of airline discrimination in recent memory. The Boeing 777 that should have been crossing the Atlantic Ocean was instead serving as a crime scene, its first-class cabin sealed off with yellow tape, while investigators photographed seat assignments, collected evidence of fraudulent boarding passes, and interviewed crew members who had been completely unaware that their passenger manifest had been compromised by bribery and discrimination. Zara Mitchell sat in the airport's VIP lounge, which Director Morse had opened specifically for her use, while the investigation continued, watching news coverage of the incident unfold on multiple screens that showed footage of Blake Morrison being led away in handcuffs and Christopher Harwick being detained by federal air marshals. The story had already been picked up by major networks with headlines like "Billionaire CEO Discriminated Against at Own Airport" and "Gate Agent Arrested for Accepting Bribes to Deny Service," flashing across screens throughout the terminal. Her damaged phone had been replaced by airport personnel within 20 minutes, and she now had access to the flood of messages and calls that had been pouring in from business associates, government officials, and media outlets who were trying to understand the implications of what had happened at Gate B12. The video footage captured by passenger witnesses had already gone viral on social media with millions of views and thousands of comments that ranged from outrage at Blake's behavior to admiration for Zara's calm handling of the situation. But what struck Zara most as she watched the coverage wasn't the vindication of seeing her attackers face consequences for their actions. It was the realization that this incident had exposed patterns of discrimination that went far beyond one gate agent's bad judgment and one passenger's willingness to pay for preferential treatment. The investigation that had been triggered by her phone call was already revealing systemic problems with how airlines trained their employees, monitored customer service interactions, and responded to complaints of discriminatory treatment. Director Morse appeared in the lounge doorway with the kind of expression that suggested she was delivering news that would require careful consideration. "Ms. Mitchell, we've completed our preliminary investigation of the incident, and I thought you should know what we've discovered about Mr. Morrison and Mr. Harwick before the information becomes public." Zara gestured for the director to sit down, recognizing that whatever information was about to be shared would likely complicate an already complex situation. "What did you find?" Blake Morrison's financial records show that he was under significant pressure due to custody issues, medical expenses for his mother, and threatening letters from collection agencies. Director Morse began her tone suggesting that she was trying to provide context without excusing criminal behavior. He appears to have been targeted by Mr. Harwick specifically because his desperation made him vulnerable to corruption. The revelation that Blake's discrimination hadn't been purely motivated by racial bias, but had been complicated by financial desperation and manipulation, by Christopher Harwick didn't excuse his behavior, but it did add layers to a situation that Zara had initially understood as straightforward prejudice and entitlement. "What about Harwick?" Zara asked, though she suspected that the answer would reveal motivations that went beyond simple arrogance and impatience. Christopher Harwick was fleeing federal prosecution for securities fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy charges related to a Ponzi scheme that defrauded investors of over $180 million. Director Morse continued. His flight tonight wasn't a vacation. It was an attempt to access offshore accounts before his assets could be frozen by federal authorities. When he bribed Mr. Morrison to give him your seat, he was essentially paying for his escape route. The information fundamentally changed Zara's understanding of what had happened at the gate, transforming it from a simple case of customer service discrimination into something much more complex involving federal fugitives, corruption of airline personnel, and the kind of financial desperation that made ordinary people capable of extraordinary moral failures. Blake Morrison, who she had seen as simply a racist gate agent with power issues, was revealed to be a struggling single father who had been manipulated into compromising his integrity by a criminal who had targeted his vulnerability. Christopher Harwick, who she had viewed as an entitled rich man throwing money around to get his way, was actually a desperate fugitive using stolen money to fund his escape from justice. "Where are they now?" Zara asked, though she was already beginning to understand that the consequences of this evening would extend far beyond her initial desire to see two men face accountability for discriminatory treatment. "Mr. Morrison has been charged with accepting bribes in a federal facility, civil rights violations, and conspiracy to commit fraud," Director Morse replied. "He's being held pending arraignment, and his attorney is already discussing plea arrangements. Mr. Harwick is facing federal charges for the bribery as well as the underlying securities fraud and flight risk violations. He'll likely be denied bail given his attempt to flee the jurisdiction." The weight of knowing that her phone call had not only ensured justice for her own treatment, but had also prevented a federal fugitive from escaping prosecution settled on Zara's shoulders like a responsibility she hadn't asked for but couldn't ignore. Blake Morrison's life was destroyed. His son would grow up with a father in federal prison, and his elderly mother would face medical bills without his income to help cover the costs. On the other hand, Christopher Harwick's victims would finally see justice for the money he had stolen, and the airline industry would be forced to confront the ways that financial pressure on employees created opportunities for corruption and discrimination that affected countless passengers who didn't have the resources to fight back. The terminal around them was slowly returning to normal operations, with passengers boarding delayed flights and maintenance crews working to clear the backlog of departures that had been caused by the security incident. But Zara knew that the ripple effects of what had happened tonight would continue for months or years, changing policies, ending careers, and forcing conversations about dignity, discrimination, and the price of justice that the aviation industry had been avoiding for far too long. As she finally boarded a later flight to London, taking her seat in the same 1A that Blake Morrison had tried to deny her, Zara Mitchell reflected on the fact that power and justice were sometimes the same thing, but that using power to ensure justice always came with consequences that extended far beyond the immediate satisfaction of seeing wrongdoers face accountability for their actions. The federal courthouse in downtown Chicago had seen thousands of criminal cases pass through its marble halls over the decades, But the prosecution of Blake Morrison and Christopher Harwick for what media outlets had dubbed the terminal discrimination scandal drew the kind of attention that transformed routine judicial proceedings into public theater about race class and the price of moral failure in modern America. 3 months after the incident at Gate B12, Blake Morrison sat in the defendant's chair looking like a ghost of his former self. The confident gate agent who had worn his Employee of the Month pin like a badge of honor had been replaced by a gaunt, hollow-eyed man in an ill-fitting orange jumpsuit who had lost 20 pounds during his time in federal custody awaiting trial. His mother's medical condition had deteriorated. Without his income to help pay for medication, his ex-wife had been granted full custody of their son after his arrest made national news, and his court-appointed attorney looked like she was going through the motions of a defense that everyone knew was doomed from the beginning. At a separate table sat Christopher Harwick, whose transformation was even more dramatic than Blake's physical decline. The arrogant real estate mogul who had thrown money around like confetti while demanding preferential treatment had been revealed as a desperate criminal whose lifestyle had been funded by stolen money and whose escape attempt had been foiled by his own greed and prejudice. His expensive suits had been replaced by prison uniforms, his salon-styled hair had been buzzed to regulation length, and his confident smirk had been replaced by the haunted expression of someone who understood that his life as he had known it was over. Judge Zara Mitchell had presided over hundreds of federal criminal cases during her 15 years on the bench, but she had never dealt with defendants whose actions had revealed so much about the intersection of economic pressure, racial bias, and institutional corruption in American society. The evidence against both men was overwhelming, documented by multiple witnesses, recorded on passenger cell phones, and confirmed by financial records that showed the exact movement of money from Harwick's accounts to Morrison's pocket. "Mr. Morrison," Judge Chen said, her voice echoing in the packed courtroom where journalists, civil rights advocates, and aviation industry representatives had gathered to witness the conclusion of a case that had already changed policies at airlines across the country. "You stand before this court having pleaded guilty to accepting bribes in a federal facility conspiracy to commit civil rights violations and wire fraud related to the manipulation of passenger manifests." Blake stood slowly, his legs shaking as he faced the judge who would determine whether he spent the next several years in federal prison or received the kind of lenient sentence that his attorney had been hoping for based on his cooperation with prosecutors and his claims of financial desperation. His mother sat in the front row of the gallery, her oxygen tank a visible reminder of the medical costs that had contributed to his vulnerability to Harwick's corruption. "Your Honor, I want to say that I am deeply sorry for my actions and the harm they caused," Blake said, his voice barely audible as he read from a statement that his lawyer had helped him prepare. "I let financial pressure and fear for my family's welfare cloud my judgment, but I understand that those circumstances don't excuse the choices I made. I discriminated against Ms. Mitchell based on her appearance, I lied about her payment status, and I accepted money to deny her the service she had legitimately purchased." The apology was necessary for sentencing purposes, but Judge Chen had read the pre-sentencing report and understood that Blake's remorse was complicated by the reality that he had genuinely been manipulated by a more sophisticated criminal who had targeted his desperation and exploited his weaknesses. The case raised difficult questions about individual responsibility versus structural pressures that made vulnerable people susceptible to corruption. "Mr. Morrison, the court recognizes that you were under significant financial stress at the time of these offenses," Judge Chen continued. "However, the position you held required you to treat all passengers with equal dignity and respect, regardless of their appearance, race, or perceived economic status. When you chose to accept a bribe to discriminate against Ms. Mitchell, you didn't just commit a crime. You violated the basic principles of human dignity that our civil rights laws are designed to protect." Blake nodded, tears streaming down his face as he realized that his moment of weakness had not only destroyed his own life, but had contributed to a legal precedent that would affect how discrimination cases were prosecuted in federal facilities for years to come. Taking into account your cooperation with the investigation, your lack of prior criminal history, and the circumstances that made you vulnerable to Mr. Harwick's manipulation, this court sentences you to 18 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release," Judge Chen announced. "You are also permanently barred from employment in any position that requires federal security clearance or involves access to sensitive passenger information." Blake's mother sobbed audibly as the marshals moved forward to take her son into custody, while his ex-wife held their 8-year-old son close and tried to explain why Daddy was going away for a long time because he had made very bad choices when he was scared and desperate. Christopher Harwick's sentencing was far more straightforward, given that his crimes extended far beyond the airport incident and included years of systematic fraud that had destroyed the retirement savings of dozens of families who had trusted him with their money. The evidence of his Ponzi scheme filled multiple filing cabinets, and the victims who had lost everything because of his greed had been given opportunities to address the court about the impact of his crimes on their lives. "Mr. Harwick, you orchestrated a complex criminal enterprise that defrauded investors of over $180 million while maintaining a lifestyle of luxury and excess that was funded entirely by stolen money." Judge Chen said, her voice carrying the weight of moral authority as she prepared to deliver a sentence that would effectively end Harwick's life as a free man. "When federal authorities began investigating your crimes, you attempted to flee the jurisdiction by bribing airport personnel to deny service to another passenger based on her race." Christopher tried to maintain some semblance of dignity as he faced the consequences of his actions, but his defense attorney had already warned him that the combination of financial fraud and civil rights violations in a federal facility would result in a sentence that would likely keep him imprisoned until he was too old to pose a threat to society. "The court sentences you to 15 years in federal prison to be followed by 5 years of supervised release," Judge Chen announced. "You are ordered to pay full restitution to the victims of your investment fraud, and you are permanently barred from working in any capacity that involves handling other people's money or investments." As Christopher Harwick was led away in shackles, Zara Mitchell sat in the back of the courtroom and reflected on the fact that justice, while necessary, rarely felt like the triumph that victims imagined it would be. 2 lives had been destroyed, families had been shattered, and while the legal system had functioned as intended, the human cost of discrimination and corruption extended far beyond the criminals who had been held accountable for their actions. The conference room on the 57th floor of Horizon Infrastructure Group's Chicago headquarters had floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city, including a perfect sightline to O'Hare International Airport, where the terminals looked like toys from this distance, but represented the epicenter of changes that were rippling through the entire aviation industry. 6 months after the incident that had made Blake Morrison and Christopher Harwick household names, Zara Mitchell was chairing a meeting that would determine how those changes would be implemented across the facilities under her operational control. The executives gathered around the mahogany conference table, represented airlines, airport authorities, and civil rights organizations that had been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about discrimination bias and the structural pressures that made ordinary employees capable of extraordinary moral failures. The viral video footage of Blake's lies about Zara's payment status and his physical assault on her property had become required viewing in customer service training programs across the country, but Zara was determined to ensure that the response went far deeper than sensitivity seminars and diversity workshops. The Morrison-Harwick incident exposed problems that extend far beyond one gate agent's bad judgment. Zara began addressing the room with the authority of someone whose business empire gave her the leverage to demand meaningful change rather than cosmetic reforms. "We have documented evidence of cultural patterns within airline operations that prioritize passenger status over basic human dignity, that reward employees for accommodating bias rather than challenging it, and that create financial pressures that make corruption seem like a reasonable solution to economic desperation." Janet Cruz Blake Morrison's former supervisor had been terminated immediately after the investigation revealed that she had explicitly coached Blake to prioritize premium passengers over policy compliance and had ignored multiple complaints about discriminatory treatment from travelers who didn't have the resources to escalate their concerns to federal authorities. Her replacement director, Sarah Williams, was a former civil rights attorney who had been brought in specifically to reform training programs and accountability measures. Ms. Mitchell, we've implemented comprehensive bias recognition training for all customer-facing employees. Director Williams reported, referring to the tablet that contained data on policy changes that had been rolled out across multiple airlines since the federal charges against Blake and Christopher had made national headlines. We've also modified our performance evaluation systems to include metrics for equitable treatment of all passengers regardless of their ticket class or perceived economic status. The changes were significant, but Zara had learned from her years in business that real transformation required more than policy adjustments and training programs. It required changing the incentive structures that rewarded discrimination and the cultural assumptions that made bias seem natural and inevitable. "Training is important, but it's not enough," Zara replied. "Blake Morrison didn't discriminate against me because he lacked education about bias. He discriminated because the system he worked in rewarded him for keeping premium passengers happy and punished him for following policies that might inconvenience people with status and money. Until we change those incentive structures, we're just putting Band-Aids on a culture that fundamentally values some human beings more than others." The financial impact of the terminal discrimination scandal, as it had come to be known, extended far beyond the criminal penalties faced by Blake and Christopher. British Airways had settled Zara's civil rights lawsuit for an undisclosed amount that sources suggested was in the 8-figure range, while the airline industry as a whole was facing increased federal oversight and mandatory reporting requirements for discrimination complaints that had previously been handled internally and quietly. But the changes that Zara was most proud of involved the employees who worked in the facilities under her control. The gate agents and security personnel and customer service representatives who dealt with frustrated travelers during the most stressful moments of their journeys. The new policies she had implemented provided mental health support, financial counseling, and emergency assistance funds that were designed to address the kind of economic pressure that had made Blake Morrison vulnerable to Christopher Harwick's corruption. We've established employee assistance programs that provide confidential support for workers facing financial crises, family emergencies, or other personal challenges that might affect their ability to make ethical decisions under pressure," reported Marcus Thompson, the former military officer who had been hired to oversee employee welfare initiatives across all Horizon-controlled facilities. "We've also implemented anonymous reporting systems that allow employees to seek help when they're being pressured to compromise their integrity by passengers or supervisors. And the most controversial change involved the elimination of performance metrics that rewarded employees for processing premium passengers more quickly than economy travelers, replacing them with standards that measured courtesy, problem-solving effectiveness, and adherence to anti-discrimination policies." Airlines had initially resisted these modifications, arguing that they would reduce efficiency and customer satisfaction among high-value passengers who expected preferential treatment. But the data that had accumulated over 6 months of implementation told a different story. Passenger complaints about discriminatory treatment had decreased by 73%. Employee satisfaction surveys showed significant improvement in job security and workplace culture, and even premium passengers reported higher satisfaction with service that was consistently professional rather than obsequious. "The most important lesson we've learned," Zara concluded as the meeting drew to a close, "is that treating all passengers with dignity and respect doesn't cost money. It makes money." Blake Morrison lost his career and his freedom because he thought that discrimination was a customer service strategy. But the evidence shows that bias and prejudice are actually bad for business, as well as morally indefensible.
As the executives filed out of the conference room, Zara remained at the window looking out at the airport, where her confrontation with Blake Morrison had triggered changes that extended far beyond her personal vindication. The terminals in the distance represented millions of travelers who would be treated more fairly, because one woman had refused to accept discrimination, quietly had documented bias when she encountered it, and had used her resources to ensure that the consequences of prejudice were immediate, meaningful, and impossible to ignore. The phone on her desk buzzed with a message from her assistant. British Airways requesting meeting to discuss expanding anti-discrimination policies to international operations. They're calling it the Mitchell Standards. Zara smiled as she realized that her name was becoming associated not with victimhood, but with the expectation that every passenger deserved to be treated with dignity, regardless of how they looked, what they wore, or whether gate agents thought they belonged in the spaces their money had purchased. The minimum security federal correctional institution in Milan, Michigan, was nothing like the violent prisons that Blake Morrison had imagined during the months between his arrest and sentencing, but it was still a place where freedom was measured in 15-minute intervals, and privacy was a luxury that no longer existed. For 8 months, he had shared a dormitory-style room with 5 other inmates, eaten meals at predetermined times, and participated in rehabilitation programs that were designed to address the thinking errors that led to criminal behavior. The letter that Blake had been writing and rewriting for 3 weeks lay on the small desk in the prison library, its pages covered with crossed-out words and revised paragraphs that represented his attempts to find language that could express remorse without sounding like self-pity, accountability without excuses, and understanding without presumption about forgiveness that he knew he didn't deserve. Writing to Zara Mitchell felt like the most important thing he had ever attempted, and also the most impossible. Dear Ms. Mitchell, the latest draft began. I know that nothing I can say will undo the harm I caused you, and I'm not writing this letter to ask for your forgiveness or to make myself feel better about the choices I made. I'm writing because the programs here have helped me understand how my actions affected not just you, but everyone who witnessed them, everyone who experiences discrimination, and everyone who now has to live in a world where my behavior became an example of how bias and desperation can destroy basic human decency. Blake had spent months in group therapy sessions where other inmates had shared their own stories of moral failure, financial pressure, and the moment-by-moment decisions that had led them to federal prison. He had learned that his experience wasn't unique, that many people faced with overwhelming circumstances made choices they never thought they were capable of, but that understanding the context of criminal behavior didn't excuse it or reduce the harm it caused to victims. The hardest part of the rehabilitation process had been confronting the ways that his own unconscious bias had made him susceptible to Christopher Harwick's manipulation. In sessions with prison counselors, Blake had been forced to examine his assumptions about who belonged in first class, who deserved respect, and how he had learned to associate appearance with worth in ways that made discrimination feel natural rather than chosen. I used to think that I wasn't racist because I never used slurs or joined hate groups, Blake continued in his letter. But the programs here have helped me understand that bias isn't just about what you believe. It's about how you act when you think no one important is watching. When I saw you in that hoodie, I made assumptions about your right to be in first class that I never would have made about a white passenger dressed the same way. That wasn't just bad customer service. It was discrimination based on racial prejudice that I didn't even recognize in myself. Meanwhile, in the maximum security facility in Terre Haute, Indiana, Christopher Harwick was discovering that federal prison for white-collar criminals was nothing like the minimum security country club environments that his lawyer had described during plea negotiations. The protective custody that kept him safe from inmates who had been victimized by financial fraud also isolated him from most human contact, leaving him alone with the reality that his 15-year sentence would likely be the rest of his meaningful life as a free man. Christopher's wife had divorced him 6 months after his conviction, taking their 2 children to live with her parents in California,
and legally changing their last names to distance themselves from the scandal that had made Harwick synonymous with fraud and flight risk. His assets had been seized to pay restitution to the victims of his Ponzi scheme, leaving him with nothing but the knowledge that his greed and arrogance had destroyed not just his own life, but the financial security of dozens of families who had trusted him with their retirement savings. Unlike Blake, Christopher had not responded well to the rehabilitation programs available in prison, continuing to maintain that his crimes were victimless business disputes and that his attempt to bribe Blake Morrison had been simple customer service rather than conspiracy to commit civil rights violations. His appeals had been denied, his attempts to reduce his sentence had failed, and his refusal to accept responsibility for his actions had made him a pariah even among other white-collar criminals. Back in Blake's letter, the writing continued with painful honesty. "My son is 9 years old now, and he asks his mother why Daddy is in prison and when I'm coming home. She has explained to him that I hurt someone because of the color of her skin and that I took money to be mean to a nice lady who didn't do anything wrong. He doesn't understand why I would do something so terrible, and honestly, I don't understand it either. I know what circumstances led to my choices, but I can't explain why I thought those circumstances justified treating another human being as less worthy of respect and dignity." The ripple effects of Blake's actions extended far beyond his own imprisonment to affect everyone who had depended on him for support and stability. His mother's medical condition had worsened without his income to help pay for medications and treatments, forcing her to rely on Medicare programs that provided basic care but not the comprehensive support she needed. His son was receiving counseling to help him process the shame and confusion of having a father who had become a national symbol of discrimination and corruption. "The worst part isn't the prison sentence or the loss of my career," Blake's letter concluded. "The worst part is knowing that I raised a child who now has to grow up explaining why his father was willing to treat people differently based on how they looked. I've participated in every program available here, not because I think it will reduce my sentence, but because I need to understand how I became someone capable of the choices I made. When I get out, I want to be the kind of person my son can be proud of, even if I can never undo the harm I caused you and everyone who witnessed what I did." Blake never sent that letter. Instead, he folded it carefully and placed it in his personal belongings, along with dozens of other drafts that represented his ongoing attempts to understand accountability, remorse, and the possibility of redemption for someone whose actions had revealed the worst aspects of human nature under pressure. What Blake didn't know was that Zara Mitchell had already taken steps to ensure that his son's future wouldn't be destroyed by his father's choices. Through an anonymous scholarship fund administered by her foundation, the boy's education would be fully funded through college, giving him opportunities that Blake's criminal record and imprisonment might otherwise have foreclosed. It was an act of grace that Blake would never learn about a recognition that justice sometimes required, ensuring that the innocent victims of criminal choices had access to the resources they needed to build better lives than the ones that had been damaged by discrimination, corruption, and the terrible human cost of moral failure under pressure. 8 months after the incident that had made her a reluctant symbol of justice in the aviation industry, Zara Mitchell walked through the automatic doors of O'Hare International Airport Terminal 3, wearing the same charcoal gray hoodie that had triggered Blake Morrison's discriminatory assumptions and led to the most documented case of airline bias in modern history. But this time, her presence wasn't driven by desperation to reach her dying grandmother or exhaustion from marathon business negotiations. It was a deliberate test of the changes that her confrontation with institutional discrimination had forced throughout the industry. The terminal looked the same from a distance, with its soaring ceilings and gleaming floors, and the constant flow of travelers navigating their way through the controlled chaos of international air travel. But Zara could see subtle differences that reflected the cultural transformation that had been implemented across all facilities under her operational control. Digital displays promoted respectful treatment of all passengers. Customer service stations were staffed with employees who had completed comprehensive bias recognition training, and surveillance systems, now included mandatory review protocols for interactions that might involve discriminatory treatment. More importantly, the atmosphere felt different in ways that were harder to quantify but impossible to miss for someone who had experienced the before and after of institutional change. The interactions between staff and passengers carried a more consistent professionalism that didn't shift based on ticket class or assumptions about economic status, and the employee break areas displayed reminders about dignity, respect, and the expectation that everyone who worked in the terminal would treat every traveler as a valued guest. Zara made her way through the concourse with deliberate casualness, observing the natural flow of customer service interactions, without revealing her identity or authority. She wanted to see how the new policies functioned when employees thought they were dealing with ordinary passengers rather than performing for the owner of the building, and she was particularly interested in how staff handled situations involving travelers who didn't fit conventional expectations about who belonged in premium spaces. At Gate B12, the same location where Blake Morrison had accepted Christopher Harwick's bribe to deny her service, a new gate agent named Patricia Williams was dealing with exactly the kind of situation that had exposed the discriminatory culture of the old management system. A young man in gym clothes and sneakers, carrying a skateboard and looking frantic with stress, was pleading for help with a missed connection that threatened to prevent him from reaching his sister's wedding in Denver. "I'm telling you, I missed the cutoff by just 2 minutes because the train broke down." The young man explained, his voice cracking with desperation, as he held up his phone to show the delayed arrival notification that had caused him to reach the gate after the boarding deadline. "I've been saving for months to afford this ticket, and if I can't get to Denver tonight, I'll miss the ceremony. Please, there has to be something you can do." Under the old system, this interaction would likely have resulted in rigid adherence to policy, with the gate agent explaining that missed connections were the passenger's responsibility and suggesting that he purchase a new ticket at full price or wait for the next available flight with space. Blake Morrison had been trained to prioritize efficiency over problem-solving, to view passenger distress as a potential threat to operational smooth functioning, rather than as an opportunity to demonstrate the kind of service that created customer loyalty. But Patricia Williams had been hired and trained under the new protocols that emphasized creative problem-solving empathy and the understanding that every passenger represented someone's family member, someone's important journey, someone's once-in-a-lifetime experience that deserved respect regardless of their appearance or ticket class. "Let me see what options I have available," Patricia said, her voice carrying genuine concern as she began typing rapidly on her computer keyboard. "I can't reopen this flight because the manifest is already sealed, but we have a code share agreement with United and they have a departure to Denver in about 90 minutes. I can transfer your ticket value and get you on that flight for just the change fee, which would be $40. Can you manage that?" The young man's face lit up with relief and gratitude as he realized that someone in authority was actually trying to help him, rather than simply enforcing rules that would result in his missing one of the most important events in his family's life. "Yes, absolutely, I can do $40, he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "Thank you so much for actually caring enough to find a solution." Zara watched this interaction from a distance, feeling a deep satisfaction that went far beyond personal vindication to encompass the knowledge that systemic change was possible when institutions were held accountable for the culture they created and maintained. Patricia Williams was demonstrating exactly the kind of customer service that Blake Morrison could have provided if he had been working within a system that rewarded empathy and problem-solving rather than bias and rigid adherence to policies that served efficiency over humanity. As the young man hurried away with his new boarding pass and directions to the United Gate, Patricia looked up and noticed Zara standing nearby. There was a moment of recognition as the gate agent realized that she was looking at the woman whose confrontation with discrimination had led to the job she now held, the training she had received, and the expectation that every passenger would be treated with dignity regardless of their appearance or assumptions about their economic status. "Ms. Mitchell," Patricia said, standing up straighter as she recognized the person whose experience had become a catalyst for industry-wide reform. I hope you saw that we're really trying to live up to the standards you helped establish here. I saw exactly what I hoped to see, Zara replied, approaching the counter with a smile that reflected genuine pride in the transformation that had been achieved through sustained effort and institutional commitment to change. You didn't just follow policy. You solved a problem. You didn't just process a transaction. You helped someone get to one of the most important days in his family's life. That's what customer service looks like when it's based on seeing every passenger as a complete human being with dignity and worth. Patricia beamed with pride as she realized that her approach to customer service had been validated by someone whose opinion carried the weight of institutional authority. The training we received really emphasized that every passenger has a story, and our job is to be part of the best possible version of that story rather than an obstacle they have to overcome. As Zara continued her walk through the terminal, she reflected on the fact that real change happened not through grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but through the accumulation of countless individual interactions where people chose empathy over indifference, problem-solving over rigid rule-following, and dignity over discrimination. The young man who had just been helped by Patricia Williams would remember that kindness for the rest of his life, and that memory would shape his expectations about how institutions should treat people when they're vulnerable and need assistance. The transformation of Terminal 3 from a place where discrimination was enabled by cultural indifference to a space where every passenger could expect respectful treatment represented the kind of institutional change that extended far beyond policy modifications to encompass a fundamental shift in values and expectations. Blake Morrison had lost his career and his freedom because he chose to participate in a culture that dehumanized passengers based on appearance and assumptions. But Patricia Williams was thriving in a new culture that rewarded her for seeing every traveler as deserving of dignity and assistance. The letter arrived at Zara's office on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered through the kind of circuitous legal channels that ensure communication between federal prisoners and their victims can occur without compromising security protocols or violating the terms of supervised correspondence. The envelope was thin, the handwriting careful and deliberate, and the return address identified it as coming from the Federal Correctional Institution in Milan, Michigan, where Blake Morrison was serving his 18-month sentence for accepting bribes and committing civil rights violations. Zara had received hundreds of letters since the incident at Gate B12, ranging from thank you notes from passengers who had experienced similar discrimination to business proposals from organizations that wanted to capitalize on her newfound prominence as an advocate for justice in travel accommodation. But this letter felt different as she held it heavier somehow, despite its modest length carrying the weight of accountability and remorse that had been missing from Blake's behavior during their original confrontation. Ms. Mitchell, the letter began, I have written this letter dozens of times over the past 8 months, trying to find words that could express my understanding of the harm I caused you without making excuses for my actions or presuming to ask for forgiveness that I know I don't deserve. I am writing now not to make myself feel better, but because the rehabilitation programs here have helped me understand that accountability requires acknowledging harm in specific terms, rather than general apologies that minimize the reality of what discrimination does to its victims. The letter continued for 3 pages, written in the careful handwriting of someone who had clearly spent considerable time choosing each word and phrase. Blake described the therapy sessions where he had been forced to confront his unconscious bias, the moments of painful recognition, when he realized how his assumptions about appearance and worth had made him susceptible to Christopher Harwick's manipulation, and the ongoing work he was doing to understand how financial pressure had compromised his ability to see other people as fully human. I used to think that I couldn't be racist because I never used slurs or joined hate groups, Blake wrote in the section that Zara read twice, trying to understand whether his insights represented genuine growth or simply the kind of therapeutic language that prisoners learn to use in letters that might be reviewed by parole boards. But I've learned that bias isn't just about what you believe in your conscious mind. It's about how you react when you're under pressure and think no one important is watching. When I saw you in that hoodie, I made assumptions about your right to be in first class that I never would have made about a white passenger dressed the same way." The letter included no requests for meetings, no appeals for clemency, and no suggestions that his punishment had been excessive given his circumstances. Instead, it focused on Blake's growing understanding of how discrimination affected not just its immediate victims, but everyone who witnessed it, everyone who worked within institutions that enabled it, and everyone who had to live in a society where bias was treated as normal rather than harmful. "The worst part isn't the prison sentence or the loss of my career," Blake concluded. "The worst part is knowing that my son now has to grow up explaining why his father was willing to treat people differently based on how they looked. I can't undo the harm I caused you, but I can commit to becoming the kind of person who would never again choose financial pressure over human dignity, who would never again allow desperation to compromise basic respect for other people's worth." Zara set the letter down on her desk and stared out the window at the Chicago skyline, processing the complexity of emotions that came from reading genuine remorse from someone whose actions had caused her pain and humiliation. The letter suggested that Blake Morrison was engaging seriously with the consequences of his choices, but it also raised questions about forgiveness, accountability, and whether understanding the causes of harmful behavior created any obligation to respond with mercy rather than simple justice. The investigation that had followed Blake's arrest had revealed the full extent of his financial desperation, the custody battle that was draining his savings, the medical bills for his mother's diabetes treatment that consumed most of his paycheck, and the collection agencies that had been threatening legal action if he didn't make payments on debts that were growing faster than his income. Christopher Harwick had targeted Blake specifically because his vulnerability made him susceptible to corruption, offering money that represented temporary relief from pressures that felt overwhelming and inescapable. Understanding those pressures didn't excuse Blake's discrimination or justify his acceptance of bribes, but it did complicate Zara's feelings about the consequences he was facing. His 8-year-old son was growing up without his father attending school where other children might recognize his last name from news coverage of the discrimination incident. His elderly mother was struggling with medical costs that had become more difficult to manage without Blake's financial contribution to her care. That afternoon, Zara called her foundation's education director and authorized the creation of an anonymous scholarship fund that would ensure Blake Morrison's son had access to educational opportunities, regardless of his father's criminal record or the financial devastation that had followed his imprisonment. The scholarship would cover tuition books and living expenses through college, giving the boy a chance to build a life that wasn't limited by his father's choices. It was an act of grace that Blake would never learn about a recognition that justice sometimes required protecting the innocent victims of criminal choices from bearing the full burden of consequences they hadn't chosen. Zara didn't make this decision because she forgave Blake Morrison, or because she thought his punishment was excessive, but because his son deserved opportunities that wouldn't be available if his father's discrimination continued to destroy his family's future. The letter remained on Zara's desk for several days before she finally dictated a brief response that acknowledged Blake's communication without offering the absolution he hadn't requested. "Mr. Morrison, I received your letter and appreciate your willingness to examine the choices that led to your current situation. Real accountability requires sustained commitment to change rather than expressions of remorse, and I hope your rehabilitation continues to provide insights that prevent future harm to others." She never mentioned the scholarship fund, never revealed her decision to ensure that his family wouldn't bear the full financial burden of his choices, and never suggested that understanding the context of his actions had diminished her commitment to ensuring that discrimination faced immediate and meaningful consequences. Justice and mercy, Zara had learned, weren't opposites but different aspects of the same commitment to human dignity that required both accountability for harmful choices and protection for innocent people who became collateral damage in the aftermath of moral failure. 14 months after the confrontation that had changed multiple lives and forced an entire industry to examine its treatment of passengers, Zara Mitchell found herself back in seat 1A of a British Airways flight, but this time her journey to London was driven by celebration rather than desperation. Her grandmother's memorial garden was finally ready for dedication, and the quiet ceremony that awaited her in London would honor the woman who had taught her that dignity was never negotiable, and that power without compassion was just another form of cruelty. The flight attendant who approached her seat was Nancy Rodriguez, the same crew member who had witnessed the original confrontation with Blake Morrison and had seen the transformation of airline culture that had followed in its aftermath. Nancy had been working international flights for 15 years, and she had watched the gradual evolution of industry policies from the inside, seeing how the Mitchell standards had changed not just training programs and customer service protocols, but the fundamental expectations about how passengers should be treated regardless of their appearance or ticket class. "Miss Mitchell, it's good to see you again," Nancy said, her voice carrying genuine warmth rather than the practiced courtesy that characterized most airline interactions. "I wanted you to know that the changes your experience triggered have made this a much better job for all of us. We're not just serving passengers anymore, we're protecting their dignity." As the plane prepared for departure, Zara reflected on the ripple effects that had spread from a single moment of discrimination to encompass changes that would affect millions of travelers for years to come. The Mitchell standards had been adopted by airlines across multiple continents, creating expectations about respectful treatment that went far beyond the United States aviation system to influence how hospitality industries approached customer service in contexts where bias and discrimination had previously been overlooked or excused. But the most meaningful changes weren't the policy modifications or training programs that had received media attention. They were the countless individual interactions where employees now chose empathy over efficiency, problem-solving over rigid rule enforcement, and dignity over discrimination. Gate agents like Patricia Williams were helping passengers navigate travel emergencies with creativity and compassion. Security personnel were treating all travelers with consistent professionalism, and airline executives were measuring success not just by profit margins, but by passenger satisfaction surveys that specifically evaluated respectful treatment across demographic categories. As the aircraft reached cruising altitude, and Zara opened her laptop to review the memorial ceremony program, she noticed a young black girl, perhaps 11 or 12 years old, walking confidently down the aisle toward the restroom. The girl wore a NASA sweatshirt and carried herself with the kind of quiet confidence that suggested she was accustomed to traveling alone and expecting respectful treatment from airline staff regardless of her age or appearance. When the girl returned to her seat in the premium cabin, none of the flight attendants questioned her right to be there. None of the other passengers stared with suspicion, and none of the crew members made assumptions about whether her ticket was legitimate or her presence was appropriate. She was simply another passenger, another traveler, another human being, whose dignity was protected by institutional changes that had made discrimination more difficult and respectful treatment more automatic. Zara smiled as she realized that this was what justice looked like in practice. Not dramatic courtroom victories or media coverage of criminal sentencing, but the quiet transformation of everyday interactions that ensured future travelers wouldn't face the assumptions and barriers that had characterized her own experience before she had the resources and authority to fight back. Her phone buzzed with a message from Patricia Williams at Gate B12. "Helped a military family navigate a connection emergency today. The new protocols worked perfectly, and they made their son's graduation ceremony. Thank you for showing us what real customer service looks like." The message was followed by a photo of the family at the gate, smiling with relief and gratitude as they held boarding passes that would get them to their destination on time. It was the kind of simple human moment that represented the ultimate purpose of institutional change, ensuring that systems served people rather than forcing people to navigate hostile systems that treated their needs as inconveniences. As the plane began its descent into London Heathrow, Zara looked out at the city where her grandmother had lived her final years fighting cancer with the same dignity and determination that had characterized her response to decades of discrimination and struggle. The memorial garden that awaited dedication was located in a community center that served immigrant families, many of whom faced the same barriers and assumptions that had shaped her grandmother's life and had continued to affect Zara's experience even after she had achieved wealth and success. The ceremony would be small and private, attended by people who had known her grandmother as a community advocate rather than as the relative of a billionaire, but it would represent the completion of a promise that Zara had made during her grandmother's final days, that her legacy would include not just personal success, but institutional change that protected the dignity of people who didn't have the resources to protect themselves. During the memorial service, as Zara spoke about her grandmother's teaching, that character was revealed not in moments of comfort but in responses to injustice. She realized that the confrontation at Gate B12 had been less about her own vindication and more about honoring the values that had been passed down through generations of women who had faced discrimination with grace and had used their strength to create opportunities for others. The Mitchell standards weren't just policies about airline customer service. They were institutional recognition that every person deserved to be treated with dignity regardless of their appearance, their accent, their ticket class, or their assumptions about their economic status. They represented the kind of change that her grandmother had dreamed of but had never lived to see, a world where bias and discrimination faced immediate consequences and where empathy and respect were expected rather than exceptional. As Zara flew back to Chicago the following week, she carried with her the knowledge that justice was not a destination but a continuous process of choosing compassion over cruelty, dignity over discrimination, and hope over cynicism. Blake Morrison was serving his sentence and learning to understand the harm that unconscious bias could cause when it was amplified by desperation. Christopher Harwick was facing the consequences of a lifetime of choices that had prioritized greed over integrity. And millions of travelers were moving through airports around the world where employees had been trained to see every passenger as deserving of respect, where policies protected dignity rather than enabling discrimination, and where the legacy of one woman's refusal to accept unfair treatment had created changes that would outlast any individual's memory of the incident that had sparked them. The plane touched down in Chicago as the sun was setting, painting the sky in colors that reminded Zara of her grandmother's garden and the promise that beauty could grow from the hardest ground if it was tended with patience, determination, and an unwavering commitment to the belief that everyone deserved to be treated as if they mattered. 3 years have passed since that snowy New Year's Eve at O'Hare Terminal 3, and the changes that began with one woman's refusal to accept discrimination have rippled far beyond the aviation industry. The Mitchell standards are now taught in business schools as a case study in how individual courage can transform institutional culture, while airports around the world have implemented policies that prioritize dignity over status and respect over revenue. Blake Morrison completed his sentence and now works with rehabilitation programs that help former inmates understand how unconscious bias can lead to criminal choices. His son, whose education is secured by an anonymous scholarship fund, recently wrote an essay about how his father's mistakes taught him that character is defined by what you do when you think nobody important is watching. Christopher Harwick remains in federal prison, his 15-year sentence, a reminder that corruption and discrimination in public spaces carry consequences that extend far beyond individual harm to encompass threats to the basic principles of equal treatment and human dignity. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel and share your thoughts about how we can continue building a world where everyone is treated with the respect they deserve. Let us know in the comments how you've witnessed discrimination or stood up for others in your own life. Together we can ensure that dignity is never negotiable and that justice remains accessible to everyone, not just those with the power to demand it.